Close your eyes for a moment. Forget everything you know about your day. Forget the alarm on your phone. Forget the shower, the coffee, the commute. Forget the fluorescent lights and the hum of electricity running through every wall. Now open them. It is the year 1250. You are somewhere in the heart of medieval Europe. The world around you is almost entirely dark. The air smells of wood smoke and wet earth and animal. The sky above is a blaze of stars so thick and brilliant that the sight of it would stop a modern person cold. There are no clocks. There are no schedules. There is no calendar on your wall. There is only the sky and the earth and the slow turning of a day that is about to begin. This is 24 hours in the medieval world, not the medieval world of films and fantasy, not the gleaming armor and romantic quests, the real one, built from soil and fire and labor and faith, hour by hour, from midnight to midnight. Let us begin. Midnight. The village is not entirely asleep. Medieval people slept in two distinct phases. The first sleep began at dusk, when darkness fell and there was no longer enough light to work by. The body, governed by natural light, drew them down into sleep. Then around midnight, they woke. This was not insomnia. It was the natural rhythm of the human body without artificial light. The monk's night office, prayers sung in the cold dark of the monastery chapel around 2 a.m, was built around this natural waking. The monks simply organized what everyone's body was already doing. In a peasant cottage, the midnight waking was quiet and purposeful. A man might check on the animals in the byre nearby, listening for sounds of distress. A woman might tend the fire. Couples talked in the dark. Medieval sources suggest this was considered a particularly honest and intimate time, a space for reflection that the busy daylight hours never allowed. Outside, a night watchman moved slowly through the village track. His job was to watch for fire, the medieval settlement's most constant and devastating threat. A single thatched roof catching flame could consume an entire village within an hour. He carried a horn to raise the alarm and walked in careful silence, listening. Beyond the village edge, the world was genuinely dark in a way impossible to convey to a modern person. No distant city glows, no headlights, no lights of any kind. The forest pressing against the village was ancient, unmapped, and in the deepest hours of night, it felt like it belonged to something other than the human world. At least that is what medieval people believed. And belief in this world shaped behavior as powerfully as any physical fact. 1 a.m, in the monastery a mile from the village, the bell rings for matins. Monks rise in darkness, dress in rough wool habits, and file in silence into the chapel. The sound of their chanted Latin prayers drifts faintly across the fields, thin and distant, carried on still air. For most villagers lying awake in their midnight waking, this sound is simply part of the world, familiar as birdsong, but it is also a reminder of the invisible structure organizing medieval time. The monastery is a clock. Its bells reach far enough to regulate the rhythm of the entire surrounding community. After prayers, the monks return to the dormitory for the second sleep. In the village, the waking hours are ending too. People settle back into their blankets, into the warmth of bodies and embers, and the second sleep pulls them under. The night deepens. The stars wheel. The watchman makes another circuit. Nothing is wrong. 3 a.m, the coldest hour. The earth has been radiating its stored heat since sunset, and by 3 a.m, it has given almost all of it back to the sky. Temperature drops to its lowest point precisely now. In a peasant cottage with no insulation beyond thatch and mud-plastered walls, the cold seeps in. The banked fire gives barely enough warmth to matter. Bodies pressed together under rough wool blankets. In the castle, stone walls moderate temperature better. Tapestries hung on walls trap thin layers of still air. The Lord's chamber has its own fireplace. A young page sleeping on a pallet across the doorway is responsible for keeping it alive through the night. At the monastery gate, the night porter sits in his small gatehouse with a small fire and a lamp. Monasteries were required by the rule of St. Benedict to offer hospitality to any traveler at any hour. The porter was the physical embodiment of this obligation. and travelers moved through the night more than we might imagine. Merchants, pilgrims, and messengers all covered ground in darkness, guided by moonlight and the stars and roads they had walked many times before. 5 in the morning, the darkness is still complete, but something has shifted. Birds know it before humans do. A single blackbird somewhere in the hedgerow begins. One tentative call, then silence, then another. Medieval people paid close attention to birdsong. The cuckoo's first call in spring was one of the most eagerly anticipated sounds in the medieval world. It meant the cold was breaking. Planting time was near. In the peasant cottage, the household stirs at the first bird calls. The woman rises first and moves to the hearth. She kneels before last night's coals and begins the careful work of reviving the fire. Dried moss, careful breath, patient coaxing. This moment happened every single morning, in every household, across the entire medieval world. No chronicler thought it worth recording. No poet celebrated it. Yet it was as essential as anything that would follow. The fire catches. Light blooms in the darkness. The day has begun. 6 in the morning, dawn. The church bell rings for prime as the sun clears the eastern horizon. Doors open across the village. Men move immediately to the animals, because animals do not wait for human convenience. Cows need milking. Oxen need feeding before they can be put to work. Pigs need slopping. Chickens need releasing. The relationship between a peasant and his animals was nothing like a modern person's relationship with a pet. These animals were survival infrastructure. A cow that stopped giving milk was a crisis. A work ox going lame at plowing time was a potential catastrophe. So they were watched with obsessive attention. Their behavior, their appetite, the look of their eyes. All of it was read by people who had spent their entire lives learning to read it. Inside, breakfast was being prepared. Pottage, thick oat or barley porridge, sometimes enriched with dried peas and a piece of salt pork fat, simmered in the iron pot over the fire. Stale, dark bread was laid out on the rough wooden table. A jug of small ale completed the meal. The family ate quickly, standing or on low stools, in the dim light of the fire, and whatever came through the single small window. Covered in oiled linen rather than glass, admitting a little gray morning light. Breakfast was eaten quickly. The day was burning. 7 in the morning, the fields were active. The medieval open field system meant the village's arable land was divided into common fields, subdivided into narrow strips belonging to different families. Each family worked their own strips, but all followed the same crop rotation. This was not a limitation. It was a system of collective risk management, refined over generations. In the plowing season, teams of oxen moved slowly along the furrows. The plow team was typically a communal resource. Most families could not afford a full team alone, and the cooperative management of shared animals was one of the most basic forms of village cooperation. A man walking behind a heavy plow in clay soil for hours at a stretch was performing physical labor of an intensity most modern people never experience. Archaeological study of medieval peasant skeletons shows patterns of extreme bone stress and muscular development consistent with a lifetime of heavy labor beginning in early childhood. The body of a medieval peasant was a working body in a way the modern body simply is not. 9 in the morning, the village was not only farmers. The blacksmith was perhaps the most important craftsman in any medieval settlement. His forge, identifiable by the sound of hammer on metal and the smell of hot iron, was where essential tools were made and repaired. Plowshares, horseshoes, knife blades, door hinges. The blacksmith worked from early morning until his light failed, and the work was never done. The miller ran the water mill where grain was ground into flour. Milling was technically demanding. The gap between millstones had to be precisely calibrated. Too wide produced gritty flour. Too narrow generated enough friction to start a fire. The miller was also a figure of mild social suspicion in most villages. He was positioned to take more than his legitimate share of the grain passing through his hands, and this was widely assumed to be exactly what he did. The alewife, the woman who brewed ale for sale, was another essential figure. She might sell from her own cottage, hanging a green bush above the door to signal fresh ale was available. This was one of the few commercial occupations a medieval woman could run with relative independence, and alewives were economically significant in village life. 11 in the morning in the castle, the morning had its own rhythm. The lord rose later than the peasants, not from laziness, but because noble time was organized differently. Lords managed estates, adjudicated disputes, maintained military readiness, and conducted the political negotiations that kept their positions secure. Morning began with prayer in the castle chapel. Breakfast followed in the great hall, already busy with the steward reviewing accounts, and the cook managing the enormous task of feeding a household of dozens or hundreds. The hall was a precise social map. At the dais sat the lord and honored guests. Further down, arranged exactly by rank, the rest of the household. The positioning of where you ate was not trivial. It was a statement about who you were, and everyone understood it. The food at the Lord's table was incomparably richer. Roasted meats, expensive Eastern spices, white bread from finely milled wheat. Down the hall, darker bread. The inequality was deliberate, visible, and encoded into every meal. Midday. Noon, the church bell rang for sext. Work paused. The sun was at its highest. The shadow of the gnomon, a simple vertical post in the churchyard, was at its shortest, pointing north, marking true midday with nothing more than a stick in the ground. Midday was dinner, the main meal of the day. The pottage pot had simmered all morning. Bread accompanied it. Ale filled the cups. If there was meat, and there was not always meat, it was likely salt-preserved pork from the autumn slaughter. Every part of the pig was used without exception. But on many ordinary days, the protein came not from meat, but from legumes. Peas and beans, dried and stored, were the protein staple of the medieval poor. Not celebrated, not desired, simply necessary, eaten in large quantities by the people who built the cathedrals and plowed the fields. The midday meal was also a news exchange. In a world without any written news or communication technology beyond the spoken word, meal tables were where information traveled. Who was ill? What the weather had looked like further west? What the Lord had demanded in the new labor dues? Yawn in the afternoon. The afternoon work of medieval women is perhaps the most invisible part of medieval history. While men returned to fields, women were simultaneously engaged in work that is genuinely difficult to categorize, because it encompassed so many different skills at once. Spinning, which occupied every moment that hands were not otherwise engaged. Tending the kitchen garden of herbs, onions, and cabbages. Managing children by keeping them busy with tasks rather than letting them run idle. Processing food, pressing cheese from morning milk, turning drying herbs, checking stores for spoilage, mending. Every item of clothing in a medieval household was handmade and expensive in the labor it represented. A single woolen tunic meant weeks of work, shearing, washing, carding, spinning, weaving, cutting, sewing. It was not discarded when worn thin. It was patched, recut for children, and finally used as rags. The mending basket was never empty. A medieval woman managing a household was simultaneously a food scientist, a textile manufacturer, a pharmacist, and a supply chain manager. The invisibility of this labor in most historical accounts is one of history's greatest oversights. 3 in the afternoon. In the fields, the pace of work was being measured against the declining light. This was one of the most consistent features of the medieval working day. The constant background awareness of how much daylight remained. When light failed, work stopped. Not by choice, but by necessity. An experienced medieval farmer could judge remaining daylight hours with impressive accuracy from shadow angles and sun position. This was not a special skill. It was simply what happened when you spent every working day of your life outdoors and needed to know. The afternoon also brought the movements of those whose work took them from house to house. The barber surgeon might be making a call. His tools combined the genuinely useful with the catastrophically wrong. He could clean wounds, set bones, extract teeth. Medieval wound management, honey, egg white, and cobwebs as sealants, was more effective than it sounds. He could also bleed patients, which was wrong, but consistent with the only medical theory available. The village priest made his rounds too. Parish priests were not remote figures encountered only on Sundays. They were community members, called to the dying, blessing fields and animals, writing documents for those who could not read or write themselves. 5. In the afternoon, Vespers bell. The sun was low. Men and women made their way back along the muddy village track, tools over their shoulders, bodies carrying the weight of another day. Evening milking had to happen before full dark. Animals had to be settled and secured. In winter, pigs and sometimes cattle were brought inside to share their body heat with the household. The smell was considerable. The warmth was essential. Water had to be drawn from the well or stream, carried in heavy wooden buckets, a task for older children or women. There was no piped water. Water came from wherever it naturally gathered, and the distance to the nearest reliable source was a significant factor in where medieval settlements were built. As the household gathered for supper, leftover pottage reheated, bread, cheese, more ale, the day's information was processed. What had happened in the fields, what the traveling peddler had said about the market town to the east, what was worrying and what was not. 7 in the evening Compline, the last official prayer of the day, sounded from the monastery. The productive day was ending, the social evening beginning. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, giving a dim, wavering, faintly foul-smelling light, were lit sparingly. The hearth fire gave the most light at the least cost, and the family clustered around it. Spinning began. The drop spindle or spinning wheel occupied women's hands through every evening hour. Its low rhythmic hum was the background music of the medieval night. It continued through conversation, through storytelling, through crying babies. It never really stopped. Men repaired things by firelight. A broken harness strap worked back into pliability. A cracked tool handle. A basket coming apart at the rim. The medieval household was its own repair workshop, and every evening's light was an opportunity to prevent tomorrow's crisis. 8 in the evening. This was the hour of stories. In a world without any recorded media, without books for most people, without music that could be stored and replayed, without any way to preserve or transmit human voices, stories were the primary technology of both entertainment and memory. Medieval storytelling was not a casual hobby. It was a sophisticated oral art form serving multiple functions at once. Stories entertained. The bawdy comic tales of foolish husbands and clever wives that circulated across France and England were crude, funny, and genuinely clever. Stories instructed. The tale of the farmer who ignored the signs of an approaching storm and lost his harvest was not just entertainment, but a lesson in reading weather. Stories preserved memory, and stories were sacred. The lives of saints, gospel events, miracles of local holy places. These were woven into the same fabric of evening telling as the comic tales, making the supernatural feel as immediate and present as the physical world. The medieval imagination was not impoverished. It was extravagant, vivid, and deeply strange, populated with saints and demons, magical animals and enchanted places, the active daily intervention of the divine. These were not metaphors. They were understood as literally real. 10 in the evening in the village alehouse, the last customers were finishing their drinks. The alehouse was a simple place. A room in a cottage, rough benches and tables, the alewife presiding over a fresh batch. It was not sophisticated entertainment. It was somewhere outside the confines of your own household, where you could sit, drink mildly, and talk. The conversations covered everything they cover in bars today. Local gossip, complaints about authority, the Lord's increased labor demands, the miller's dishonest weights, agricultural intelligence, how the crops were looking, signs of blight in the rye. What the king was doing mattered less than what the Lord was doing. and what the Lord was doing mattered less than next week's weather. But the alehouse also served as a place where informal community governance happened. Medieval villagers were not passive subjects of a top-down feudal order. They negotiated, pressured, and organized. The hall moat provided formal village courts. The alehouse provided the informal ones. Alliances were built and broken. Grievances were aired. Within the village's own social sphere, medieval peasants had considerably more agency and political sophistication than the romantic image of helpless serfs suggests. 11. In the evening, the children had been asleep for hours. Medieval children went to bed when darkness fell because their bodies, governed by natural light cycles, uncomplicated by any artificial stimulation, demanded it. The idea of keeping a child up past dark to watch a screen, complete homework, or attend a social event would have been incomprehensible. By 11, the household was closing toward its first sleep. The fire was banked, coals buried under ash to preserve them through the night. The animals were quiet. The spinning wheel stood still. In the castle, the great hall was emptying. Trestle tables had been dismantled and stacked against walls, because the great hall was not just a dining room. It was a sleeping room. Many members of the household slept on the hall floor, rolled in blankets near the central hearth. Only the lord and his family had private chambers. Everyone else shared whatever space was available, and the hierarchy of sleeping location mirrored the hierarchy of everything else. Higher status meant closer to the fire and better bedding. Lower status meant straw pallets near drafty walls. The dogs settled in the hall too, their warmth an unacknowledged but welcome contribution to the night. Midnight, again. And so we return to where we began. Not easy to survive 24 hours in medieval. Subscribe for more videos.